All right. That was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. All right. So today I have with me John. We're going to be talking about giving our perspective on Mass of the Ages 2. So John and I are both normies in that we go to the Novus Ordo, and we both go to a reverent Novus Ordo. And so I wanted to discuss it with someone along with you guys in the chat. If you guys want to give your opinions on YouTube, you can do that. I'll throw them up here if you guys think we missed something. But yeah, so yeah, so I guess that's it. I'm trying to like level it down. I'm still getting used to this as like my second live stream.
Sure, yeah,
so,
yeah.
Sorry about that, John. I know this is like a little awkward as I'm just flailing in the wind.
That's okay. Yeah. No, I felt the same way about it. There were some things I didn't know, some facts I learned, and just kind of some perspectives that, you know, I just hadn't heard before, you know, and these were, it came with a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different perspectives. And I liked that it did that. Well, so I guess it was kind of divided into parts. The first part was really talking about, you know, like a call or a need for change, and then calling the council, and then the council, what they wanted really wasn't the same as the end product that came out.
Yeah, that is definitely what was portrayed in the video.
Right, because to me, because I didn't really understand why they wouldn't just translate the mass.
Yeah, so like
let's just take the Latin mass and just literally translate it.
So let's state something, because I think some people misunderstand, especially those that have never been to a TLM. A TLM is not simply the Novus Ordo in Latin, and the Novus Ordo is not simply the TLM in the vernacular.
And what we mean by TLM, traditional Latin mass, and Novus Ordo is the mass localized to the specific language, just in case anybody's confused or anything.
Yeah, so like it's not simply a matter of translations, and some people will sell that as the point. In fact, I've been in a few arguments the last few days where people will say, oh, well, it's just a superficial aspect that of going from Latin to English, and that they want the Latin. And I'm like, no, that's not it at all. Like, that's just not what history has shown. And like, that's just, this video does a good job of exploring a lot of the finer points that you would want to see in terms of some of those decisions. Like, I think for me, like what really blew me away was the hymns compared to like all the like modern day, like in the 70s, all the modern day music. So like My Little Pony. Like, yeah, it's funny, but it's sad at the same time. Like,
well, and I was kind of like, I thought back to that video where the ukulele guy shows you that every song is the same certain chords. So I didn't know if they were like inspired by it, or if it was like it just happened to be. If they did take it from My Little Pony, I'm very worried. But I was like, okay, maybe I'll give him the benefit of the doubt or something there. But no, it was really funny.
Right, and it's. I think what they did in terms of showing, because if you watch the video, it does a very good job of comparing parts of the mass to what's in the Novus Ordo, like those that are shared by the Novus Ordo and the TLM, because not everything is shared. And they do a good job of, at least I think, the way they show the difference between the Novus Ordo and the TLM. There's like an overlap of the prayers, and then there's a taking away of the prayers, and what's left is the Novus Ordo. And I thought they showed that really well without saying, like, there's nothing pejorative about it in terms of like what they showed there. It was just simply a matter of, all right, well, we're just going to lift this up, and then you see like what's left, and that's what's in the Novus Ordo.
Sure. Yeah.
Huge spot.
So I guess let's kind of break it down one at a time. So you
Sure.
had them talking about the music first.
Yep.
And I like that because one of the comments that was made that really stuck out to me was the kids from the 1960s liked it. And then they grew up. And it was like, yeah, like you can't, you know what I mean? It's the same
Yeah.
thing as like, you know, now I'm a bad example because I listened to a lot of my mom's favorite music from the 70s and 80s, but like it's not going to translate. And so I thought that was so interesting when they were talking about how it was like, yeah, that like, and a lot of the hymns that like I still see in some masses are from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And I think that that was an excellent point, that it made the mass very like applicable to a specific time. And so then it doesn't translate to a following generation. That was an interesting point and I liked it a lot.
Well, right. And I think we're seeing that now, like, and we're seeing that with like places like, well, you know, there's not just my parish, but there's other parishes that are trying to go back to before the 70s, and they're using hymns from like Aquinas or from like 580 Irish hymns. Like
Sure.
we sometimes do that. I'm citing what we do without saying that it's just us, because it's not just us, because there's other parishes in the Archdiocese of Detroit that will do that. But then exactly to your point, there's several that still use the 70s, and you're just kind of like, you see everyone, and typically those parishes, having been around the diocese quite a bit, they do tend to be the older generation. They do tend to be the younger kids grown up.
Yeah, and
we're at
I
that
think
point now. We're like 60 years down the line. Like,
well, and I one of the thoughts that kind of came to me as I was watching it was I came to Christianity with a conversion experience at Steubenville South. So
okay.
Not that I was an atheist before, but faith just didn't matter to me before I was about 15. It just wasn't a part of my life. And so there are a lot of those music that's kind of the, you know, Christian rock, young kids music from like the early 2000s that I still hear and I still like. Right. But it's just me because I grew up with it. And so that wouldn't connect with somebody 20 years later, or I'm not that old, but 15 years later, was just a thought that I had in my head. Like there was a youth mass that I would go to that was packed to the gills because everybody loved all the songs from that youth ministry. And it's almost funny because you could almost make an argument two ways from the way that they're talking about it. One, you could say, hey, the 1960 music is done. Let's make Christian music like the 80s and then the 90s and then the 2000s. Or you could say, let's go back to the hymns. But I think you kind of got the worst of both worlds because it's stuck in this 1960s to 80s garbage.
Right.
That nobody likes except boomers, basically.
Well, right. And I do think that the argument is stronger more on the side of having like the eternal style.
Yeah, going with something
because then you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel with the hymns. Now, that doesn't mean that new hymns can't exist. So that's very different. So you can have new in style, let's just say in style hymns that are part of like Gregorian chant or can, you know, Mozart, for example, is someone that did that during his time. So we can have Mozarts today. The problem is that they're being confiscated by people in video games because that's where the instrumental pieces of art are.
Yeah, it was really funny.
Like Halo, for example. I'm just bringing this up. Like Halo, for example, uses Gregorian chant, and that guy actually makes Gregorian, like him as an individual. I forget his name, but he actually makes Gregorian chant for the mass. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the style for the Halo. Oh yeah,
I think that there's definitely something to be said for that. Yes, I I agree with that completely. There had been
Yeah.
a couple of masses that I went to at a smaller monastery where it was just a priest and a few brothers and like maybe 20 laity. And
Right.
the music was provided just by people chanting, or like it was one person in the crowd, and it was very beautiful.
Right. I mean, it's like it's beautifully simple. It's not complex. It's not dynamic. It's there to help people focus. And
Right. And I think that there is something to connecting the mass to the more physical objects as well. Because I know that there's a music like there's a, if it's a hymn, I don't know if it's him, but it's that song In Christ Alone.
Mhm.
You know, and you've heard it sung very poppy and whatever. And then there was Celtic worship that did In Christ Alone with bagpipes and like a trumpet and all of, and I said, oh man, this gives it, you know, it gives it more meat. I don't, for lack of a better term.
Well, so like, okay, sorry, go ahead. I'm
So like that, Mary, did you know? I think there are more modern songs that can still take on that timeless feel if you sing them well and grounded, and not like we've got an electric piano and like a synthesizer and
yeah.
you know.
Well, yeah, I do. And like one of my favorite, let's just say folk music. So this will be, we'll go on to the next part after this, but
Sure.
And thank you, Jerry, for what you said. He's my I like to call him my caramel friend.
Okay.
He's Chaldean. So
Oh, I thought you meant he was like a Carmelite.
no. No. He's we talk like three times a week. He's a really good friend of mine. But he so like the I really like Lord of the Dance. That is something I would really like to hear at a bar. But like my priest says, if you like to hear it at a bar, you probably don't want to hear it in mass. And it's like, yeah, like yes, that is exactly, I agree with that. So all right. So I guess what's the next part you would like to go on to?
So there was the music, and then there was the elimination of a lot of scripture to try to bridge the gap between Protestants and Catholics. And I had never heard an explanation for why certain things were changed. And that's interesting.
Well, right. And they do give, I mean, they do give a reason. They cite
yeah, I had just never heard that at all.
I mean,
until this video.
So I would hear that, but I would hear that in the most, let's just say, aggressive way possible. I'd hear it from like sedevacantists. And
Right.
they come out and say like, oh, it was made to be more Protestant, and like Pope Paul VI is a terror and not really a pope, and all this other baggage along with it. But then you're like, okay, so the true, you know, the facts, episode 2 comes out and explains how things happened. And with Father Bugini quoted. And so like, I think that's like the huge part there, where it's like, it is a quote. It is something he said, and it's very easily verifiable. So if someone's going to say, all right, well, he didn't actually say that, you know, like, all right, we'll provide the evidence. And I haven't gone looking for that type of evidence. I know there's some people who are skeptics in that regard, but the idea, if he really did say that, and that really did happen, that should really give us pause now. And I relate that to I think it was 2002 or 2004, when Cardinal McCarrick came out with, well, he didn't come out with, he received from Cardinal Ratzinger from the CDF a letter about the way that pro-choice politicians should be handled, and whether or not they should be warned that what they're doing is a mortal sin, and whether or not that's good or bad. And so Cardinal McCarrick changes a few parts of it, presents it to the USCCB, and then they make a vote based off that. Nothing seems to happen because Nancy Pelosi and Biden are still doing what they usually did. And then later, when the internet is being used by people in my generation, because I was part of the first generation to actually be of age to use the internet. You see it on the internet that what Cardinal Ratzinger said, like compared to, you know, what Cardinal McCarrick said, and you're just kind of like, okay, so we know for a fact that there's a change that happens. Why aren't we going back and just, why isn't the USCCB going back and voting on that? And so now it's like, okay, well, we know the guy who was orchestrating the NO, the Novus Ordo. Again, we both go to the NO, and I'm speaking only for myself. I'm not speaking for John here, but
sure.
For me, it seems like if we know this was the reason, why aren't we going back and being like, oh yeah, let's do our due diligence and, you know, make it less Protestant?
Like, yeah, I think one of the things that struck me was they had somebody, and I think this is kind of a perfect example, is they had somebody who was part of the Catholic faith in the 80s and the 90s and had never heard the St. Michael prayer. Mm-hmm. And was like, I didn't think we believed in demons anymore. You know, and it's little things like that where it's like the reality of saints, the reality of heaven and hell, the reality.
Purgatory.
Right.
Purgatory was a big one for me where people legitimately did not know. So I'm 36. At around 2004, 2006, I'm talking with other Catholics, and they are legitimately questioning whether purgatory is like a thing.
Yeah. And the way that they were saying like certain things were cut out to make it more Protestant friendly. And look, I think I understand some of that sentiment. So trying to read it in the most benevolent light, in the most charitable light possible, Protestantism, at least where I'm from, was stealing members from the Catholic Church left, right, and center. There were areas bleeding out into Protestantism. And so this idea that we were going to make the Mass more accessible and more Protestant-like, maybe it made sense, right? So like and that's just something anecdotally in my area, that pre-Vatican II, we were losing Catholics. So I don't know what the reason was, but reading it charitably, they're trying to reach across the board to Protestants. And I think maybe lost a few steps in that process. Well,
okay. So John's from Louisiana. I'm from Michigan. And
sure.
So I'm just letting people who are watching know. And so I think I think it's more than just like, because it's one guy making, like, seemingly, you know, according to the episode, we haven't fact checked this stuff. Okay, so that's why I'm being lawyerly in terms of what I'm saying, because I haven't fact checked this stuff. But according to the episode, you know, it's basically around Bugini and what he did, where he kind of played both sides to get what he wanted. And so I think it's more than just a matter of, well, they tripped and they went too far. It was like there was one particular person who wanted to put it in his image.
Sure.
And that, I think, was the problem, because, you know, we aren't we're not like, what is it? We're not the Orthodox, right? Like, so we don't have all these bishops and they're all equal in say or whatever. But what we do is we do reference each other. So the Pope will ask other bishops for advice, or, you know, set up the councils or set up meetings like what they had. The problem is, or at least it seems, was the appointment, the guy who was the nexus for all of this. And that I think was I think fundamentally that's a problem. If that is true, that is a problem, regardless of whether or not he's a Freemason. So I know that accusation there, whether or not he's a Freemason, there is that problem. And to what you said about them trying to bridge the gap, generally speaking. So like, they definitely put Pope Paul VI in a good, I don't want to say in a good light, because it wasn't a like, oh, he's a fantastic Pope.
Yeah, they basically painted it as like a single bad guy. And so for me, I'm gonna hold reservation until I know a little bit more.
Well, when they say, okay, sorry, I just want to add context.
Yeah, yeah.
When you say single bad guy, it's not Pope Paul VI, because that's
Right,
what we were
right,
immediately
right.
talking about. It was Bugini. And so, but like how they show that, like they do, you know, they show the quotes and they say the quotes. And so it's I think a matter of like making sure those quotes are in context if you're a skeptic about it. And that's I think a healthy view, because I mean, people left, right, you know, left, right, and in the middle are all trying to figure out what the truth is. And we don't want to take something as necessarily the gospel truth if it isn't, right? Like we
Well,
want
and
to
I
make sure
think
that
that looking at something kind of similar, like which one is the Catholic one, Life Team or Young Life? One of them is the Catholic one and one of them is the Protestant one.
I don't know.
But I get them confused. But
Right.
like when I was coming up, you had Protestant youth groups and Catholic youth groups, and they were basically identical, and they were definitely taken from Protestants. So
Right.
I think that across the board, the Catholic Church saw the Protestants having short-term success.
Yep.
And kind of going, you know, so I don't think the mass was the only thing. I think implementations of things like Young Life or Life Teen or whichever one is the Catholic ripoff version, because they're so similar, I get them mixed up.
Right.
So it wasn't just, oh, the mass changed and like nothing else happened. It was like, no, the church has been chasing Protestantism forever, you know?
Thanks, Gary.
There we go.
Well, so like the church hasn't quite been chasing Protestantism forever, but
well, for the last 50, 60 years.
I do want to say, I think what happened, if we were really going to like get into the nitty gritty of this, is given the exercise of American power and given that American power is mostly Protestant, that the church trying to have some influence into that is kind of a big deal. Now, like, that doesn't mean we should, I'm not, the idea that, because you're right, like they didn't just touch the mass, they touched all 7 sacraments and they watered them down.
Sure.
And like that's kind of a big deal, because they're trying to appease like Protestant sensibilities, but by doing so, like you said, like they're having these short-term gains. But part of, like, I guarantee you, like most of that was based off ignorance. And the problem, instead of like being superficial about all of this, which if you look at, because even though that's claimed to be against people who are traditionalists, it was a superficial change to make everything look more Protestant, right? Like that is inherently superficial. And so the idea of making it superficial, and instead of dealing with the fact that the Catholic faith was broad but an inch deep, like that was the problem, is that the catechesis needed more like support, and that didn't come until the 80s. And so like, you know, even that was like not as well as it could have done.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, like I think Vatican II, absolutely, the implementation is definitely influential, and I have a video where I talk about that with the priest crisis. But the idea though that we need to, like, it made me really frustrated when I saw that, because I couldn't believe that if that was the reason why, like if Protestantism was the reason why, it's like Protestantism is big, but it's not like the game, right? Like it's not everyone else.
Yeah. Well, and I think it depends on, because some churches I know would have the perspective of, we don't want to lose Catholics to the Protestants, so we're going to try to make our church as fun and upbeat as possible.
Yep.
The other one was, we're going to create a bridge for Protestants to easily come over.
Right.
And I think that both of those approaches are problematic. That being said, Protestantism has been effectively a heresy for like 500 years, more than that. So I understand there's always a temptation. Like, and I'm not saying Pope Benedict did this wrong, but he reaches across the board to the Anglicans, you know, et cetera. There's always been this, we're going to find the solution to bring them all back. And you
Yeah.
know.
But like the Anglicans, so like the Anglican, like we established a minor Anglican rite where they basically retain their form and being, you know, English. the you know, that was the thing. Like they retained how they practiced the liturgy, except with, you know, adjustments to make it, you know, to make it sound, to make it a lot like Catholic, like actually Catholic. And
Right.
so
Well,
I
and
agree,
see,
like that's a lot better, but
that's
like
an interesting point to bring up, though, that, hey, this was bad because it's bridging the gap for the Protestants, but then I don't see Set of a Contest really attack. Now, maybe they do, I don't know, but really attacking like, hey, there are these weird Anglican masses and, oh, they're awful, you know, God
well,
forbid. You know what I mean?
yeah, like my friend is down in Texas, and he's right next to where the bishop of the Anglican ordinate is, the Catholic Anglican ordinate, actual Catholic, so not the fake. Yeah, what we're talking about basically.
Sure.
And yeah, he prefers those more than no, like even Reverent Novus Ordos, just because they do look more like the TLM, but they are like in English. Like it's like crazy to think about, because we have all these variations, right? Like we have all these variations. It isn't just Novus Ordo and TLM. We have the ordinate, and then we have other regional ones, and then you have the Eastern rites, and it's crazy, like the type of swing you have when you have that exposure. And so like in where I live, we have like 8 Eastern rites, and I've been to several of them, like several of their divine liturgies and masses. Depending on which rite it is, it says mass or divine liturgy, and they're beautiful and they're different, but they're substantial. So, and they're substantial, similar to the TLM. More, let's just say it this way: they're more so substantial to the TLM than they are to the Novus Ordo.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
the
I've
Novus
heard that
Ordo
they're
kind of
great.
seems out of place when you look at all of the different rites, or at least from my, I mean, I'm only looking at like, you know, half a dozen, but like from my experience, like that's kind of how it feels, is
Yeah,
that the Novus Ordo is the one out of place, not everything else, because everything else has like high and low mass, and everything's, what is it, the Latin. So like they talk about this in the movie, or I say movie, but it's an hour and like 20 minutes. So I feel like it's a movie, but it's the Latin being removed completely was like kind of a big deal, because that wasn't really supposed to happen, because the Vatican II like
sure.
emphasizes that, like where it's like, this is supposed, like if you have the Latin Rite mass, it's supposed to have Latin, just
Right.
like you would expect Aramaic or Syrian in a Chaldean mass, or Greek in a Byzantine, or Ukrainian in a Ukrainian, like, or
Sure.
Lebanese, you know, in a Maronite. So it's like, that's what you would expect, but they're not, it's just not there. Like at best, you'll, in some places, especially around where I live, because I know we've talked about this before.
Sure.
Where I live, best you'll get the Greek, you'll get the Kyrie,
Yeah.
and that's it. Everything else is in English, and then you get eagle's wings and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, no, for me it was very different. We had very I Monsignor Mouton, Monsignor Richard Mouton was supposed, and I haven't checked into this or anything, but it was said that he was one of the people at Vatican II, that he advised on it in some way or was some part of it. But he yeah, because you just said the Novus Ordo doesn't have a high mass, and I was like, we had a high mass. And I'm like, does the Novus Ordo not have a high mass?
I mean, that would be news to me, because we just, it's,
Well,
I mean,
right. Yeah. Like,
like
so we
that,
had a
because
high
like
mass
I've
and
never heard of a high and low mass in the Novus Ordo. I've heard of basically like, there's, unless you have the Novus Ordo as every Sunday and daily, so you have daily mass, which is small, and then you have it's smaller than the Sunday masses, and then you have Easter liturgy or Easter vigil, which is the longest mass.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the only, like, in terms of length and substance, like those are the three things.
I don't know what we did at 11 a.m. then, because we had a mass like that had all the Latin and like the Glorias and all that stuff, and I mean but he was very traditional, so like we have a lot of very traditional masses here, and like I don't know, it's just different. Like we just weren't hit in the same way. I guess maybe because we're culturally French or more Catholic or something. We just weren't hit in the same Americanizing way that a lot of the other locations were hit.
Right. Well, so like that, I mean, it's kind of interesting because when you hear like Michael Knowles is in the movie again. So he was in the first video and now he's in the second video. And he said, you know, he cites that like, well, people see the NO abuses, or was it the NO abuses? He says something where it's like everywhere, where it's just obvious to everybody that something deficient is happening.
Yeah, because the young people left. It was his.
That's what it was. And it's like that's really like in like when you think about it, it is somewhat regional, but I think it's a regional, like the exceptions are smaller. Like for example, like where you
the exceptions prove the rule.
Right, like where you live, like when you were describing how you guys have Reverend Novus Ordos, and most parishes make a, you know, develop and support a priest on a regular basis, like that just does not happen where I live, and that doesn't happen in most places,
right,
where a priest comes from every parish every generation or something like that. And it's like I mean, that would be lovely if that actually happened. We wouldn't be closing so many churches if that happened, because the rate, whatever, that's the other video where we talk about the rates of priests to
I'm looking it up real quick just to see. But yeah, no, I definitely think that there was generational issues. Like how many priests do you guys ordain from your diocese?
I want to say like 7. And we're an archdiocese, so we're huge. Let me quickly do that. So
yeah,
sorry,
I'm just curious because I might be. I mean, I kept up with it like 10 years ago. It might be that it all fell off. I don't know.
Well, okay, so I can't give you the number right now because it's like it's in articles, and I'm not gonna.
Sure.
Oh, gotcha. In 2023, we had 5.
Okay.
So that was less than 7. 7, I think, was the year before. So, but like that's like I know we're gonna have a huge priest crisis, but like I said, there's another video where I talk about that. And I'm actually gonna have a follow-up video because some people keep bringing up the same arguments as if they're like they're controlling for something, and they're not quite. But let's see. So let's see, where were we? So we talked about the music, Vatican II, like the Latin. Okay, so I did want to say just one more thing about Pope Paul VI, which was I really was surprised with how favorable they did talk about Pope Paul VI, because when you hear about this, it's kind of like it's almost like a dread to me. When I was prior to the video, was looking up Pope Paul VI as being like, oh well, he was like malicious about getting rid of the TLM, and you know that's a huge talking point for a lot of sedevacantists, and even some people that may or may not be in a good relationship with Rome. But the idea that they presented was very much that he was focused on other things, more political in nature, as opposed to what was internal. And we know that in another way, right? Like he wrote Humanae Vitae, and Humanae Vitae is great. Like it's very sound, and it went against what the papal what is it? The papal advisory committee. I forget exactly what it's called, but I think it was like 2 out of the 44 wanted what was actually in the end result of what Humani Vitae had. Whereas the other 42 were like, hey, let's do contraception. And it was like, okay, well, like clearly like he's still a man. And like the question, well, okay, this is like more of a final question, but I'm not gonna say that quite yet. But I just wanted to point out how favorable they thought they presented him, and I thought that was actually like in good taste and charitable to Pope Saint Paul VI.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm the popes are in the limelight a lot, and I mean they tend to make mistakes, and finding issues is kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. So it's really easy, and I find a lot of times people, especially like with Pope Francis, it's kind of become just like a common thing to, just
right. It's
call
more
out everything.
Well, right, and there's a great deal of difference between Pope Paul VI and Pope Francis, but
sure, absolutely.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to stick to the.
Yeah. No, I mean, I thought that they presented Pope Paul VI well. Other than Humani Vitae, I don't really know much about him. Other than that, according to the 5 set of Acontists in Wisconsin, he's not a legitimate pope. So other than that, I don't really know much about him.
Right. But I mean, he was very active, and he was very active politically, at least in talks. And when he I think in terms of Bugini, when they talked about him being a Freemason, because that is, some of it is hearsay. Like, unfortunately, I would have preferred a document, like, or something where it was like the investigation showed this, but they do create a very, in my opinion, a very strong circumstantial case for him being a Freemason. And I think it's the case that after the mass goes out, there's an investigation into who's a Freemason, and then that investigation is taken seriously by Pope Paul VI, and then Pope Paul VI moves him to a place that he cannot influence anybody. And so like there's like consequences. So like there's a few things there. Like, one, it seems like he had some idea or some reservation about why he did that. It may or may not have been the Freemasonry, because obviously it's circumstantial with what we have, because we don't have all the details. But it's the fact that he thought it was well and good enough to put him in an area where he couldn't influence. And I thought that was very telling, because why would you do that? Like, this guy was in charge of literally talking to a bunch of bishops about the mass. The mass came out, the investigation happened, and then he's sent away. Like, can you imagine if the Pope came out and said the guy who's in charge of the new mass was a Freemason?
Right.
Like, if he did that, there's actually 2 things that would have happened, that could have happened. 1 would have been absolutely devastating. 2, it would have been short-term devastating, but they might have been able to correct it, in the sense that they're like, okay, well, the Freemason influenced us, and now we're going to backtrack, and we're going to do the TLM, but it's going to be in English or the vernacular or something like that, where it's like, it's more to what they wanted to do, as opposed to what seems to be the end result of something that went off the rails.
Sure. No, I agree with that in general. I mean, I wish there was more, like you said, I wish there was more evidence, because for me, and I told you this, we had talked about it a little bit, it's always interesting when there's like one figure to blame. Like, it'll be like, I'm a big boxing fan, and they're like, when Don King started managing Mike Tyson, everything went off the rails. It was Don King's fault. And you're like, he had no agency anymore. He just, like, it's just
right.
And these stories need a bad guy, So I always want to know all the facts.
Right.
Because this is all I know about it is what we've seen.
Well, right. And so like if you still take that, so if we take, if everything stated in Mass of the Ages is correct, there is still the point that Pope Paul VI is partially to blame, because he's
100%.
ultimately the overseer of all of that. He is simply delegating that to Father Begini.
Sure.
And so like that's, I mean, that's where the responsibility is. And like, again, like I sympathize with popes just in general, regardless, you know, all 266 of them, because they all had crap going on. Like every single one of them had crap going on. And when you're in charge of an entire organization, there is, it doesn't mean I'm saying everything is explainable or rationalized away. It's just, when you are in charge of an organization that has 1.3 billion members, or at the time, I think it was like just, it was under 1 billion members.
Yeah.
I don't exactly know in the 60s.
900 million or something.
Yeah, something really high. Like when you're in charge of that, like, and you're coming out of, you're still kind of coming out of World War II. And the Cold War is happening. Like there are things that are happening that are going to influence what you do, especially if you're in charge. You're looked at as the moral leader of the world, which, even it's kind of crazy to say this sometimes, but even Pope Francis still has that.
Yeah.
With everything, like, because there's still certain appeals to him that are shocking. And so I'm only using that as a for Pope Francis as a relatable thing, because it was more so during the time of the 60s and 70s. And so, when priests in movies were still looked at as, a positive thing. So that was, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I don't think there was really much else to it. I did like how Michael Knowles was just there. I don't really, other than the fact that he's like a known figure, he was just kind of like, as a non-professional, like he would just like, everything was like, I just thought every time he came on the screen, it would be like if you interviewed me about it. I'd just be like,
well, right. And so what I think what's great for him, for what he did, is because he's a known young person, right? Like he's around our ages. I think he's actually in between me and you.
He's like 33 or 34, I think.
Yeah. So like he's 33, 34. So it's like, if what young people want, that's what we're going to give them, or, whatever excuse they still use today, which I can't believe, because I have heard that. Like I've heard, the excuse of being, oh, well, the young people will like this. And I've heard this from people, and like, it's just kind of like, no, we don't. Not at all. Like we want something different. Like I actually don't like 70s music. But you know what? Like I like Gregorian chant. I like doing it. And I wish we had more opportunity to do that. And so it's like, he kind of represents us in a particular way.
Sure.
And I think that's good, because, oh, here's a young person. Yes, he's like popular and he's, conservative or whatever. But what he is he's an actual practicing Catholic who is giving his opinion to the quote unquote listening church. And so like, that's what gets me about all this, like, just in modern day, I don't understand, like, because clearly there are movements that are not the Novus Ordo that are gaining traction. And that's the charismatic movement and the traditional movement. Both of them are not typical Novus Ordos.
Sure.
The traditional movement is made up of like more reverent NOs, but also the TLMs. And there are not TLMs everywhere as much as like people would want them to be. And so it's impossible for that to only be TLMs. But there is a movement to bring Novus Ordos to what Vatican II was calling for, and to get rid of the abuses. And then you have the charismatic, where it almost kind of goes off the other way, where it's like, okay, well, this is like Pentecostal. and we're
The
using a
charismatic
lot
to
of.
me are all old people, though. I don't know any young people that are like. I mean, that's me.
I mean, like
I'm
up
speaking
here,
anecdotally.
it's so different in Michigan. Like when you say that, I'm just like, what are you saying? Like,
Well, no, like I
it's
was saying,
not.
like the most liberal church that we have has 60 people in line for confession every Saturday.
Well,
Like,
so like, but like that's not the like that is not the case up here. Like now we'll have like we will have sorry, I just wanted to bring this up. Kids these days want crazy stuff like incense and chant and see oh yeah, to see the back of the priest most of the mass. You know, praying to God in the tabernacle. And so but
no,
like
I like that a lot. We had a Novus Ordo where we had the priest face ad orientem.
mm-hmm.
And it's nice. I mean, moving the altar was always random. It was like, what does that have to do with translating the mass? Like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's in a Vatican document. It's in the oh my gosh, I can't remember what the name of it is. I always forget this one, but it's the one that talks about Latin and Gregorian chant. It or no. It is in the Vatican II document. I don't remember exactly what it is. It is in the video. And they cite it, and then they explain why that doesn't mean that it has like prime in place to be a freestanding altar in the way that everyone is making it out to be.
Sure.
And so, and I think in the way they explained it when I was watching it at the time, I thought it was really good. And so anybody who wants a reasonable argument against why like a freestanding altar is not necessarily what it absolutely should be in whatever. I'm trying not to say something. I'm trying not to bite off more than I can chew, because I don't remember what it is. So just ignore what I just said and watch the video where it talks about the point, because it's. I think they do a really good job. And so yeah, I'm trying not to say what a council said improperly. So I'm really big on that. Like I don't like saying whatever. So yeah, that's what I said.
There was like 3 coherent sentences in the last.
I know.
Your mouth. That's okay. We got 3 of them.
Yeah, we got 3 of them. So but we have because like right now, like there's a lot moving. There's a lot of moving parts, and we want to know, like, just as a generation, because we're like part of that next generation that is going to be influential to the mass, and we're raising up priests. Priests are already here. Like you have very reverent, devout priests that are, actually on the unitive way. Like they don't treat it as a side gig. They treat it as a main gig. And we're basically in a point where we're like, kind of like the same thing politically, where we're waiting for people to move on. And how they move on is up to God, but we're waiting for them to move on so we can.
They're definitely not retiring.
Well, some of them are, and that's good. But but this idea of like we're waiting for them to move on so we can actually enact change, because we see like there's so many priests that see what needs to happen, but their bishops don't.
Right.
Their bishops are still like in La La Land in the 80s and 70s, and it's like.
And I think it's just going to be
because
coming
it's like
back
your hands
to
are
preaching
tied.
the sacraments. Like, I remember I went to a mass yesterday, or I'm sorry, not yesterday, Sunday. Yes, yesterday. It was the week before, but he gave like a 15-minute homily on like, don't be afraid to come to confession. Please come to confession. Yep. And then he said, like, no amount of time that we're doing confessions is a problem. And then he went on to say, like, before Easter, we held confessions, and 2 priests were in there for like just shy of 3 hours from everybody coming to confession. And I was like, that's how you're going to do it. Yep. You're just going to preach sacraments. Facing the altar this way, that way. I think that's going to be, kind of the bread and butter of how we pull the church back together.
Well, so I do think because we have a problem up up here where there's definitely the Eucharist is not treated with.
Yeah, you got to treat God like God.
Yeah, like that's and so there is a movement where people are like, all right, well, we're gonna go adorantum because we're talking to you when we should be talking to God, and like that doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense that we would talk to us instead of talking to God. Like as if, like, yeah, God's everywhere. Like Aquinas says, God's everywhere, but they're in the Eucharist. It's substantially, like, God is substantially so, in a unique way, and so to ignore that, I think is a problem. And in the first video, so I don't know if you saw the first video, because I know I asked you to look at the second video to have a discussion on this. The first video does a really good job of explaining like the differences, like the functional differences in the TLM versus the Novus Ordo, and how like the procession happens is very different. How the prayers start, how mass starts is very different. And it's like, that to me is like so important, because there's a focus there that is lost in the Novus Ordo that the TLM like absolutely has. And I'm not saying that's going to make us like, that's a silver bullet. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I do think it'll help greatly if we could capture that back, even in an imperfect way, in the Novus Ordo.
Sure.
And again, I say imperfect, not to say that the Novus Ordo is not valid for all those people who are checking to see if I'm going to slip or whatever. It's a matter of, it's not going to be the way
You're going to make nobody
TLM
happy with this video, by the way. I'm just like,
I don't, yeah, like, but like the TLM, the way the TLM does it, it does it really, really, really well. And I don't think we can replicate that in practice for most Novus Ordos at all. Because it's just, the structure is different. And again, it's, there are things just simply missing.
Sure.
That in the NO that the TLM has. So, yeah. So yeah, just letting you know this, my wife. But yeah, we actually pointed that out at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so I guess that's, do you have anything else to say or to extrapolate?
No, we'll do episode 3. I'm excited.
Oh, you don't want to talk about anything?
No. I mean, I'm good. I think we covered it. Our video is about as long as the video we're dissecting. So
okay, yeah. So like, we kind of, yeah, we do take it a bit off at times, and that's fine. Because this is a review. This isn't
sure, yeah.
So
well, it touches on a bunch of issues.
Well, right. And so I think it's really important that we I think you're right. I don't want to like spend any more time doing it. Watch the video. I think it'd be a good watch for anybody, especially if you don't know what happened, or if you don't know the difference between a TLM and a Novus Ordo outside of one's in Latin and one's in the vernacular, because like, there's way more going on than just that. And then let's see. Oh yeah. So I am, just to let you guys know, for the next few videos, I am going to be doing a video that brings up counterpoints about some of the things. If you read the comments for the priest crisis, there's some people who seem to think they have like a gotcha moment in terms of like explaining why Vatican II wasn't an influence to the decline in priests. And I'm going to show why those are not correct, or at least not as correct as they think it is. And then I'm also going to be doing a video talking about the 2 different movements that I referenced earlier, which was the charismatic renewal and then the traditional movements that are happening, because it kind of hits the head on the nail for the kids want this, except the kids are in those two camps. They're not in the Novus Ordo. Like they're not in the, let's just say, normal 80s, 70s Novus Ordo. So yeah, those are what I got coming down the pipeline. Okay. Yeah. So besides that, you know, thank you for watching, and, you know, John, thank you for watching it and discussing it with me.
Cool.
And thank you for everybody that commented. It's always great to bring up comments, because now that I have this streaming system, it's a lot easier to bring them up and have fun back and forth with them. So thank you for watching, everybody, and have a great night.
Bye, guys.